Hello, this is Horan in the second part of a series about WoW's endgame. In the previous video we have talked about the main solo endgame content of WoW, questing, daily questing and war quests, link below if you missed it. This time we are going to talk about the history of the second level of endgame content of WoW, free people group content, main scenarios from Mist of Pandaria and island expeditions in Battle for Azeroth. A brief preamble. In Classic, Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm, WoW never had free people content. Even dungeons could be done with raid groups at the first inception of the game, and the game itself lacked any content for people who couldn't, or didn't want to, handle the typical format of one tank, one healer, 3 DPS at least. In Mist of Pandaria, for the first time in the game's history, scenarios were added. What were scenarios? Scenarios were free man group content, role agnostic, that got the players into an involved story moment or a generic scene to relive. Notable examples are the bombing of Faramore, the discovery of the heart of Yasharaj beneath the veil of eternal blossoms, or the defense of a cask of brew from Sorox and the defense of Greenstone village from an army of sprites. This sort of mini-dungeons lasted roughly 10 to 15 minutes and was rewarded with some valor, a currency then used to buy gear or gear upgrades. Later, during the lifetime of that expansion, in Phase 3, heroic difficulty was introduced for the new scenarios added in that patch, and some of the older ones, increasing the difficulty to something akin to our normal mythics today, and the level of rewards accordingly, of course. In a time in which valor points were necessary to upgrade your gear and had a weekly cap, very easily daily heroic dungeons and scenarios were the easiest way to get around it. In change, especially for DPS, it meant having something instantly pop for you as you were queued for dungeons or LFR. Being role agnostic also meant that you could join with friends, much and such as island expeditions today, without having to worry about halting. 2 people available in need of some courtesy? Here done. Was it all blue skies and rainbows? No. Before the start of expansion itself, feedback was very lukewarm to say the least about the feature. You see, the first introduction to scenarios was Faramore's Fall scenario in Mist of Pandaria pre-patch, and it was not really good. Aside the lore issues it presented, namely a narrative in direct contradiction with the story told in the novel Tides of War, the scenario was, for what it gave, overlong and at the start way too challenging. During the expansion itself the situation changed little, even with the addition of the new heroic scenarios. Aside being overlong as well and not really rewarding enough for their level of difficulty, in the end scenarios and their heroic versions were one of the many experimented features of WoW that were abandoned after their X-Pack of Inception was over, like the Garrison or the Artifacts and Order Rolls or, soon, the Art of Azeroth. Not all of it went for naught though. The mechanics and the technology behind the scenarios will remain for years to come, used for story quests throughout Warlords of Draenor and beyond, when more involved bits of story require a smoother, streamlined approach. It also wouldn't be the last time Blizzard tried to add role-agnostic, free players content. In VFA, Blizzard tried a different approach for that kind of niche, island expeditions. An alliance vs Source scenario in which the factions would explore an island in competition to find a certain threshold of Azerite, with a weekly quest to complete a certain number of them. Needless to say, things went terribly wrong, for a multitude of reasons here. First of all, the Azerite itself was the problem. Much and such like the artifact power in Legion, Azerite power in BFA was a catch-all reward needed to empower your gear, and, as with Legion, players on the high end were interested in hoarding as much of it as possible to be up to speed with the power curve for the mythic progression. Yet, as a reward, AP is finicky, especially given the system in which it was first introduced in BFA. The higher the high level of the item, the more AP you needed, creating a loop via which you were never really done with it until you were either completed the gearing of your character or reached the very highest end of content. In addition, the existence of Azerite knowledge that actually raised the level of Azerite obtained from the various sources meaning you get more Azerite if you waited the week after for the same content, made AP intensely unsatisfying as a reward both for islands and for other kinds of content. I also personally suspect AP felt less satisfying for another reason, meaning its earning was passive. Your character gets a yellow shine and that's it. Artifact power in Legion was to a degree proactive. It was certainly a drudge to have to empty the bags of all the AP items you gained, but in Change there was, especially at the start of the Election expansion, a good degree of satisfaction in picking a spec and then empowering your weapon with it, together with a nice animation. The comparisons with the start of Legion do not end here. Islands expeditions do seem to answer to the more souls problem that plagued the first weeks of Legion. For those of you who do not know, who do not remember what happened back then, here's the short version of it. High-end players, and in general most players with an interest in endgame, wanted to hoard AP in order to be as powerful and ready for their progression as possible. Easiest and quickest way to gain AP was doing low-level keystones, and the quickest dungeon was the short, extremely linear, since it's basically a long corridor with 3 bosses, Maw of Souls. As a result, most people just swarmed the place and repeated the dungeon endlessly until they reached the relative cap and the developers had to early on adjust the values in order to prevent this behavior, since people were really getting burned out. Island expeditions are the same kind of content of a repeated dungeon with a minimal timer, but with variability in terms of environment, enemies, AI, and even rewards, aside the AP at the end of the run or the weekly quests, solving most of the issues that Maw of Souls behavior had. Quick, easy, with a soft cap, but endlessly repeatable with tons of variables to prevent most of the burnout and keep players engaged and interested. Islands expeditions, in fact, were also the source of many cosmetic rewards such as mounts and transmogs, tied though to rares or events that would have a chance to randomly spawn in a given island, making them impossible to target. But the variability couldn't hide in the long run the fact that all the exploration and the timer was easily removed by going in and mass pulling, ramboing the place down with not a care in the world and still get the rewards. If the early inception of the island expeditions in fact rewarded exploration and picking your targets with chances at specific loot, the utterly random spawn of those mini-bosses and rares soon made it so the developers decided to standardize the loot drops across the board, and even allowing players to buy the loot via the expedition-specific currency. Island expeditions' basic ideas, variability, inbuilt-in powering system, and so on are implemented in Torghast in Shadowlands, with some other ideas about character skills thrown into the mix, and, most importantly, a rising level of difficulty, but not the format of free players content. Part of the problem of Islands, in fact, stems from the lack of higher difficulty. Mythic is barely a challenge for any player at about base Mythic dungeon item level, making them mind-numbing for many players. Some higher scaling difficulty would have been helpful to keep the activity relevant and actually enjoyable and replayable, instead of feeling forced for players to do something actually boring in order to stay competitive. What lessons can we take from this? Variability is good, but not when rewards are concerned, especially of the cosmetic kind. Easy is fine, but content can't be so easy to make players feel they outlevel some core feature so quickly it becomes just a chore, something we said also in our last video about daily quests. And that's it for today. Next week, the next group content of WoW, 5-man dungeons, a brief history and the going forward wishes. See you there, and do not forget, if you like this, to like and subscribe just down below.